Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. In today's video, we're talking about the Cold War, a unique conflict that lasted for decades where the world's two superpowers, the USA and the Soviet Union, never fought each other directly, but changed the world forever. The Cold War that never ended. A cinematic history series by The Perfect Professor. The Cold War that never ended. Part 1. The war that began without a battlefield. Wars usually begin with explosions, with soldiers crossing borders, with cities burning, with the world watching in horror. But the Cold War began differently, quietly, suspiciously, with smiles that meant nothing. And that is why it never truly ended. A world too broken to trust again. In 1945, the world stood still. Europe was rubble. Cities were skeletons. Entire generations were gone. World War II had not ended with peace. It ended with exhaustion. And in that exhaustion, two powers stood taller than the rest. Not because they wanted to, but because everyone else was broken. The United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought on the same side. They had defeated the same enemy. But they had learned very different lessons from the same war. Two victors, two visions of humanity. The United States believed one thing above all. Freedom creates prosperity, markets, elections, individual ambition. To America, World War II proved that democracy and capitalism could outproduce tyranny. The Soviet Union believed something else. Power creates safety, control, central planning, absolute authority. To the USSR, the war proved that weakness invites invasion. They had lost over 27 million people. Trust was not a virtue. It was a liability. The first lie, this is temporary. At first, everyone pretended cooperation would last. The United Nations was formed. Speeches promised unity. Leaders shook hands for photographs. But beneath the language of peace, fear was already organizing itself. Because peace without trust is just a pause. Europe. The first battlefield without guns. Europe became the testing ground, not for armies, for systems. Western Europe leaned toward American aid and democratic recovery. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence and control. The continent split silently. No declaration, no treaty, just influence creeping across borders. And once influence hardens, it becomes ideology. The moment the world realized something was wrong. In 1946, Winston Churchill stood before the world and said something dangerous. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. That sentence didn't start the Cold War. It revealed it. People suddenly saw the division. East versus West. Them versus us. Freedom versus control. Once framed that way, compromise became betrayal. Fear replaces friendship. The United States feared something specific. That poverty would create revolution. That broken countries would turn communist, not by force, but by desperation. So, America acted. Money flowed into Western Europe through economic recovery plans. Factories reopened. Jobs returned. Prosperity became propaganda. The Soviet Union saw this not as help, but as invasion without soldiers. They responded the only way they knew how. Control harder, close borders, eliminate dissent. Fear became policy. When nuclear weapons changed the meaning of war, then came the weapon that made everything worse. Nuclear bombs. They ended World War II and made World War III impossible. Because a war where everyone dies is not a war, it's extinction. This created a paradox humanity had never faced. How do you defeat an enemy you cannot fight? The answer was the Cold War. War without fighting. Instead of direct conflict, the superpowers fought indirectly. Influence, economics, propaganda, threats. Every action was calculated. Push too hard, and the world ends. Push too softly, and you lose everything. This balance was not stable. It was fragile, terrifyingly fragile. Ideology becomes identity. Capitalism and communism stopped being systems. They became beliefs, almost religions. To question your side, was to help the enemy. Artists were watched. Teachers were suspected. Neighbors were reported. The Cold War didn't just divide nations. It entered homes. The arms race, preparing for a war that must never happen. Both sides built weapons they prayed to never use.
Missiles hidden underground.
Bombers ready in minutes. Submarines carrying enough firepower to erase continents. Security came from the ability to destroy the planet many times over. This was called peace. Children practiced dying. In schools, children practiced nuclear drills.
Duck. Cover. Wait.
As if a desk could stop the sun. Fear became normal. And normal fear reshaped psychology. An entire generation grew up believing tomorrow might not exist. Why no one trusted the other side. Every move looked aggressive. A new base, a threat, a new alliance, an encirclement. Even defensive actions were interpreted as preparation for attack. Intent no longer mattered, only perception. The world is forced to choose sides. Neutrality became impossible. Nations were pressured. Choose America, or choose the USSR. Aid came with loyalty. Protection came with obedience. The Cold War spread far beyond Europe. It went global, and it was just getting started. The lie that keeps echoing. People today say, the Cold War ended in 1991. The flags changed. The speeches ended. But the systems remained. The fears remained. The alliances remained. The weapons remained. And most importantly, the mindset remained. Closing. The question that starts everything. The Cold War didn't begin with a battle. It began with mistrust. And mistrust doesn't disappear with treaties. In Part 2, we will leave Europe and follow the Cold War as it turns the rest of the world into battlefields.
Vietnam. Korea.
Afghanistan.
Coups.
Dictators. Because when superpowers refuse to fight each other, other people bleed instead. The Cold War that never ended. Part 2. When other nations bled for superpowers. The Cold War had one unspoken rule. The United States and the Soviet Union must never fight each other directly, because if they did, there would be no winners, only ashes. So, they found another solution. They fought everywhere else. The most cowardly war strategy ever invented. The superpowers called it containment, defense, spreading freedom, protecting socialism. History calls it something simpler. Proxy war. Fight the enemy without dying yourself. Let someone else carry the bodies. Let someone else bury the children. The Cold War stayed cold, only for the people who mattered. Korea. The first blood offering. In 1950, Korea was a scar, liberated from Japanese rule, then instantly divided. North and South were not natural enemies. They were split by outsiders. A line was drawn at the 38th parallel.
Temporary, they said.
It never was. When war broke out, it wasn't really about Korea. It was about proving a point. America intervened for the South. China and the USSR backed the North. 3 years, millions of dead. And when the war ended, the border barely moved. Korea was destroyed. So, the Cold War could make a statement. Vietnam, where ideology ate a generation. If Korea was a warning, Vietnam was obsession. America believed, if one country falls to communism, others will follow. This fear was called the domino theory. So, the US went all in. Bombs fell on jungles. Villages vanished. Young soldiers fought an enemy they couldn't see. Vietnam wasn't a battlefield.
It was a nightmare.
And when America finally left, Vietnam was united under communism anyway. The Cold War lesson? You can destroy a country and still lose. Afghanistan. The graveyard reopens. In 1979, the Soviet Union made a mistake. It invaded Afghanistan. What followed was 10 years of hell. The USSR thought it could stabilize a friendly regime. Instead, it walked into endless resistance. America saw opportunity. Weapons flowed. Money flowed. Training flowed. Afghanistan became a bleeding wound for the Soviet Empire. Millions died. And when the Soviets finally withdrew, they left chaos behind. That chaos didn't disappear. It mutated. Coups, when democracy was optional. Not all proxy wars use soldiers. Some use silence. If a country elected the wrong leader, someone fixed it. Iran,
Chile, Guatemala, Congo.
governments were overthrown, not because they were brutal, but because they were inconvenient. Democracy mattered only when it voted correctly. The Cold War turned elections into risks. Dictatorships with superpower approval. Strongmen became assets. As long as they chose the right side. Human rights were negotiable. Torture was tolerated. Genocide was ignored. Because stability mattered more than morality. Millions learned a cruel truth. Freedom depends on geopolitics. Intelligence agencies replace armies. The Cold War loved shadows. The CIA, the KGB, they didn't wear uniforms. They didn't declare wars. They destabilized from within, funding rebels, spreading propaganda, destroying trust. Governments collapsed. Without knowing why, media becomes a weapon. Truth became flexible. Each side controlled narratives. At home, we are the good guys. Abroad, your suffering is necessary. News wasn't about facts. It was about alignment
And fear.
Africa, a continent used as a chessboard. Africa paid heavily. Civil wars fueled by foreign weapons. Ethnic tensions exploited. Resources stolen under the cover of ideology. Superpowers didn't see nations. They saw positions. When interest faded, they left ruins behind. Latin America, the backyard that burned. The US treated Latin America as strategic depth. No rival influence allowed. Revolutions were crushed. Leftist movements erased. Military juntas empowered. The Cold War taught a lesson. Geography determines freedom. The psychological damage. Proxy wars didn't just kill people. They broke societies. Trust vanished. Institutions collapsed. Violence became normal. Children grew up knowing only war. Peace felt unnatural. Why these wars never truly ended. Even after fighting stopped, weapons remained. Trauma remained. Hatred remained. Cold War conflicts didn't resolve issues. They froze them. And frozen conflicts melt violently. The hypocrisy that still haunts us. Both sides claimed moral superiority. Both committed atrocities. Both justified them as necessary.
The Cold War didn't ask,
Is this right? It asked, Is this useful? The illusion of victory. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was exhausted, economically broken, politically unstable. The Cold War seemed to have a winner. But victory was an illusion, because the methods used during the Cold War rewired the world permanently, closing the seeds of the present. The Cold War didn't just destroy countries. It created patterns, proxy warfare, regime change, information manipulation. Those patterns didn't vanish. They evolved. In Part 3, we will confront the biggest lie of all, that the Cold War ended. Because if it really ended, why does the world still feel like a battlefield? The Cold War that never ended. Part 3, why the world is still at war without admitting it. In 1991, the world celebrated. The Soviet flag came down. The Cold War, they said, was over. History had chosen a winner.
there were speeches about peace.
About a new world order. About cooperation replacing confrontation. But here is the truth no one wanted to say out loud. The Cold War did not end. It changed clothes. The most dangerous myth of the modern world. The greatest lie after 1991 was simple. Now we are all on the same side. We weren't. One system collapsed. The other assumed permanence. And that assumption created today's chaos. Because when one side believes history is finished, and the other believes it was humiliated, conflict is inevitable. Russia, a defeated empire that was never defeated. The Soviet Union didn't lose a war. It collapsed internally, economically broken, politically paralyzed. Psychologically humiliated. For millions in Russia, the 1990s were not freedom. They were collapse. Savings vanished. Life expectancy dropped. National pride was crushed. To the West, this was transition. To Russia, it was trauma. Trauma doesn't disappear. It waits. NATO. Defense or threat? During the Cold War, NATO had one purpose: stop the Soviet Union. After 1991, that enemy vanished. So, a question emerged. Why does NATO still exist? The official answer was security. The Russian interpretation was different. Encirclement. NATO expanded eastward. Former Soviet allies joined. Military infrastructure moved closer to Russian borders. To the West, this was voluntary cooperation. To Russia, it was betrayal. Because one promise haunted the background: that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Written or not, Russia believed it. Ukraine. The fault line becomes a battlefield. Ukraine was never just Ukraine. It was geography, a buffer, a bridge, a battleground of influence, culturally divided, historically complex, strategically priceless. When Ukraine leaned west, Russia panicked, not because of democracy, but because of proximity. Missiles, alliances, influence. Too close. What followed was not sudden. It was the delayed explosion of Cold War logic. The invasion shocked the world, but for those who understood the past, it felt grimly familiar. Why every side thinks it's defensive. Here's the Cold War paradox that never died. Everyone believes they are reacting. No one believes they are provoking. NATO says it's defensive. Russia says it's protecting itself. Ukraine says it wants sovereignty. All are true, and all are incompatible. This is exactly how the Cold War worked. China, the silent Cold Warrior. While the world focused on Russia, another power studied quietly. China never fought the Cold War like the USSR. It learned from it. China didn't challenge the system directly. It integrated into it.
Trade.
Manufacturing. Technology. While the West believed economics would create political alignment, China used economics to build power. No ideology sermons. No dramatic speeches. Just leverage. This is Cold War strategy. Updated. A new bipolar world without calling it one. Today's world pretends it is multipolar. In reality, it's drifting back to blocks. US plus allies. China plus partners. Russia as spoiler. Trade wars replace proxy wars. Sanctions replace invasions. Technology replaces missiles. But the logic is identical. Us versus them. Information, the new battlefield. The Cold War once fought with propaganda posters. Today it fights with algorithms. Disinformation. Cyber warfare. Narrative control. Truth is contested. Reality is fractured. Every society is now a frontline. The battlefield moved inside minds. Why democracy feels fragile everywhere. Cold War tactics normalized manipulation. Fear-based politics. Enemy framing. Loyalty tests. These tools never disappeared. They went domestic. Polarization is not accidental. It is profitable and familiar. The arms race never stopped. It just evolved. Nuclear weapons still exist. Enough to end civilization. But now we also race in
AI. Space.
cyber weapons. The logic remains the same. If we don't build it first, they will. Fear drives innovation faster than hope ever could. Proxy wars reloaded. The Cold War method is back. Fight indirectly. Ukraine, Middle East, Africa. Weapons flow. Money flows. Statements flow. Superpowers manage risk. Others manage death. Why peace feels impossible? Because peace requires trust. And the Cold War destroyed trust as a concept. Every action is assumed hostile. Every pause is assumed strategic. Even cooperation feels suspicious. That mindset never ended. It was inherited. The generational curse. Young people today didn't live through the Cold War, but they live inside its consequences. Militarized borders. surveillance states, global anxiety. The fear is inherited, not learned. And inherited fear is harder to unlearn. The final irony: the Cold War was meant to prevent World War III. In that sense, it worked. But it also normalized permanent conflict. A world always preparing for war is not a peaceful world. It is a waiting room for disaster. Can this ever end? Only if the Cold War logic ends. Not treaties, not speeches. Logic. The belief that security comes from domination, that safety comes from superiority, that peace comes from fear. History suggests otherwise. The question no one wants to answer: what happens when a Cold War lasts too long? People forget how to imagine peace. Conflict becomes normal. Division becomes identity. And the war continues, because no one remembers how to stop it. Closing. The professor's final warning. The Cold War didn't end in 1991. It ended in our textbooks. Everywhere else, it adapted. And until humanity learns to abandon the logic of permanent enemies, this war will outlive all of us. Final professor's note: the perfect professor. History isn't dangerous because it repeats. It's dangerous because we refuse to admit when it never stopped. Before we end, I have a question. Do you think the Cold War ever truly ended, or are we seeing a new Cold War starting today? Tell me about your thoughts in the comments. We've reached the end of our discussion on the Cold War. Thank you so much for joining me. Stay curious, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.